Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Med Talk with Layla and Cody.
Today in this podcast, we are interviewing a couple of scientists who worked on the recent case at GNMH.
So let me introduce you to the head scientists of this case, Gianna and Manha.
Hi guys, we're going to talk about the 11 patients who had an unknown infection at Garcia Newgard Memorial Hospital.
Wow, that sounds very difficult to solve given the gravity of the situation. This could have ended in a lawsuit.
Yes, it was, but we decided to take one in this case, not just to help the patients cure their illness, but to spread this information into the local medical community. We've performed multiple lab tests on some samples we obtained from the patients, and given the difficulty of the situation, we thought we would never find out why they were getting these infections as this outbreak appeared from nowhere. This case was very risky, and if left unsolved could have caused it to spread, worsening the situation and could have caused many deaths.
We can see that this case is very important and risky. Before we begin with what the case was, could we get some background on this case first of all, before we get into how you guys solved this?
Of course, Layla. Recently, we have observed 11 patients that had been caught with some kind of infection. They complained of red, painful, bump-like sores similar to pimples that had been oozing greenish-brownish pus or liquid. They also complained of respiratory problems and fever-like symptoms.
What did you guys believe was the source compared to the actual results then?
We had thought that it was a foodborne illness from bacteria within the Pseudomonas family. Most of the symptoms matched it, and it couldn't have been airborne because the cases would have been more than actually seen. We've come to realize after many tests, though, that it was a staph infection, which is an infection that can cause swollen boils and oozing blisters on the skin called abscesses. They often get mistaken for pimples or spider bites, but these are much more painful than them.
Can we get some more information on staph infections, please?
Sure. Staph infection, which is caused by Staphylococcus aureus, is an infection commonly found on the skin or in the nose. It could be spread from person to person, making it very contagious. Each case of staph infection is different, but most often staph will resolve in 1 to 3 weeks. Mortality rates from this are around 10% to 30%, and incidence rate is 20 to 50 cases per 100,000 people. In rare cases, staph infections can turn deadly if the bacteria invades deeper into the body or enters the bloodstream, resulting in fever, joint, muscle pain, sepsis, which is the body's extreme reaction to an infection, and death. Treatment often includes drainage of the infection and antibiotics.
Anyways, we noticed that all patients were infected with red abscesses and respiratory problems, so it was quite obvious that they most likely had the same infections, but we couldn't assume that they had the same infection quite yet, so we had to have some testing done.
Were there any other symptoms the patients all shared? Maybe some kind of common factor, such as being in the same room or having a certain antibiotic used?
The patients all had surgery involving their head or upper body, and they all had a saline IV hooked up to them, like any standard patient admitted into a hospital for surgery would. Since they had surgeries done on them, they stayed around 3 to 10 days, which is why we believed it was foodborne since they needed to eat something during their time there.
And don't forget, they also complained of having respiratory problems and all had fever-like symptoms, so high temperatures, coughing fits, common symptoms like that.
Oh yes, right. They all had the same mode of transmission.
Oh, could you explain what a mode of transmission is to us and the audience?
A mode of transmission is the way pathogens spread from person to person, which in this case was through the needles attached to the saline IVs. It's unknown how the bacteria had ever ended up inside the saline bags and how long they could have been in them for. But we can assume that they had to have gone bad or expired if bacteria had thrived in them. The needle would have transferred the expired saline solution from the storage bag into the person infecting them.
So, if I'm understanding correctly, each patient got the infection from the saline IVs, correct?
That's right. The bacteria that had been sitting within the saline bags that killed regular strands of S. aureus, but it gave other strands the ability to mutate into MRSA, which is short for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. This strand, unlike regular staph, is resistant to beta-lactam, antibiotics such as penicillins and cephalosporin. These are much more dangerous than their non-mutated counterparts, as they have a resistance to many common and accessible antibiotics used around the country and the world, making them much harder to treat than a regular staph infection.
Since you guys explained a regular staph infection and are saying how much more dangerous MRSA is, could you explain an infection with MRSA in greater detail so we and the audience could compare and contrast the original to its mutated counterparts?
Of course, MRSA is a staph germ that does not get better with the type of antibiotics that usually cure staph infections. When this occurs, the germ is said to be resistant to certain antibiotics. This string of bacteria, like said before, resists beta-lactam antibiotics such as penicillins and cephalosporin. The beta-lactam rings in these chemical compounds are essential for antibacterial activity, and these are the most common antibiotics that are used in the world to treat bacterial infections. These usually work against standard staph infections as well as disrupting peptidoglycan cross-linking or a strong, rigid, highly cross-linked polymer composed of polysaccharide chains with peptide crosses during cell wall synthesis, resulting in bacterial lysis, which is when the cell's membrane is broken down, and cell death.
Gram-positive bacteria, or bacteria that have a very thick cell wall, acquire this resistance to beta-lactam antibiotics through the production of a protein called PBP2A, which is able to avoid the inhibitory effects of the antibiotics that were stated previously. This is the mechanism by which MRSA is able to persist despite treatment with multiple beta-lactam antibiotics. This poses a big problem as resistance to common antibiotics makes them harder to treat, which can lead them to spread throughout the body and eventually become life-threatening. With the symptoms of regular staph infection, MRSA variants could, in some cases, cause pneumonia or lung infections. Hospitalized people with MRSA infections are usually treated with an intravenous medication like vancomycin or daptomycin. The intravenous antibiotic is usually continued until the person is improving. In many cases, the person will be given antibiotics after discharge from the hospital, either by mouth or by intravenous, which means it's inserted through the veins. Just general proper hygiene kept the outbreak from spreading and worsening the situation. The abscesses were monitored carefully as these certain pus that could contain MRSA, and if came into contact with another person's skin, could spread it more.
Well, it's unfortunate that the patients had to suffer through this infection, but which information led you to this conclusion?
The lab we performed gave us most of our information.
What kinds of labs? Could you specify?
Before doing any labs, we took samples of the bacteria and swiped it onto a petri dish to create sample bacteria colonies from each infected patient. We let it sit for a few days, and once we had grown enough viable bacteria colonies, the next step was to observe and identify them.
We used a microscope to observe the bacteria. We did this via the gram stain test, which dyed the bacteria based on the cell wall and shape. It was observed that the bacteria had turned purple, meaning it was positive and had a thick cell wall. If it was pink instead, it would have been gram-negative and therefore would have a thinner cell wall. This helped narrow down the search to gram-positive, and it had a very elongated shape, similar to a stick, so it was a bacillus type of bacteria. From there, we discovered that the patients had staph infection after narrowing down our choices and considering the symptoms.
Oh, okay, so these patients were infected by a probiotic-resistant bacteria. The saline within the bag gave the bacteria a chance to mutate and become resistant, while non-resistant variants were killed within the saline solution, which caused problems and confusion to staff.
Yes, that is correct. Do you guys have any other questions?
Just one more. How could this case better the local community and the medical community as a whole?
Well, this case has been a very eventful journey. This case has many lessons, like how hospitals need to be able to hold up standard health codes and proper hygiene. The hospital unknowingly giving each of those patients infected saline IVs made each patient incredibly sick, and if they hadn't contacted us, this could have worsened the situation and even result in death. Situations like this can result in people being seriously hurt and can put hospitals in a bad situations like lawsuits.
Okay, so this whole situation could have been prevented if the hospital checked if the saline was still good to use.
Yes, and it's a great relief that we solved this and now can put this whole case behind us.
Yes, and this will be all for this episode. And thank you too for your work on this case. Without you, these patients could have died.
No problem. And it has always been a pleasure to come on and tell the community and the world our story.
And we thank you, the listeners, for tuning in to this episode of Med Talk. But now we have to tune out. Goodbye.